Gotta love it when they put the spoiler right there in the title. But with all Ellie has been through over the past 5 episodes, you'd think she could catch a break. Ellie Saves the Day is the midpoint of Season 3, and it's the springboard from the story threads the first half of the season set up, and to how those threads will tie together at the conclusion of the season. A conclusion you've probably heard about. The unthinkable but obvious has happened as the Asian oil wells that JR mortgaged Southfork for are not coming in thanks to a typhoon. With no oil to show for the investment and the loans coming due soon, JR is over a barrel. An empty barrel. With Plan A falling apart, JR calls up Plan Beam.
Alan Beam.
Alan assures him that Cliff is ready to announce. JR says it has to happen now. Once Cliff is gone, Ewing Oil can start drilling again. Miss Ellie encourages Ray to settle down and build a home because
your own land is the most precious thing you can own.
I love when the writers make the episode's thesis this obvious. Bobby grills Kristen on the Southeast Asian oil well deal, but she maintains loyalty to JR and refuses to answer. Kristen pouts to JR and assures him that Bobby is at a dead end. Cliff and Pamela have lunch, and Cliff tells her that he's ready to run for Congress if his speech goes well. Pamela warns him off it for reasons unknown. He asks her to arrange a meeting with Sue Ellen, but Pam tells him to go find Sue Ellen himself and apologize to her. Bobby meets with Jordan Lee and learns that JR has gone it alone without the oil cartel. That means JR had to put up big-time collateral to secure the deal on his own, and Bobby confirms that collateral is Southfork. Cliff and Alan watch Cliff's all-but-announcement speech, and Cliff is just about ready. Back at the ranch, Bobby and JR get into a confrontation that rouses the house. JR has to admit to Jock and Ellie that he mortgaged Southfork, and that it looks pretty dire. He promises them that he'll solve it, though. Ellie quickly recognizes the irony of marrying oil baron Jock Ewing to save Southfork, only to have their son lose it on an oil deal. Jock blames himself for not teaching JR limits and says that this has reopened the wounds between him and Ellie. Everyone is at a loss. Sue Ellen offers a mixture of schadenfreude and sympathy, but JR assures her it will work out. JR seeks solace in the arms of Kristen since he's persona non grata on the ranch. Bobby laments the loss of Southfork and its impact on Ellie. He also is irony attuned as he notes that the Ewings are going to be brought down by JR instead of Cliff. JR experiences the dark night of the soul, but Alan calls with great news.
He's gonna run. He's quitting the OLM.
JR pops the cork too soon, though, as Von Leland explains that he can't give them an extension because the other creditors refuse. After all, there's no guarantee that Cliff's replacement won't be just as eco-friendly. Cliff stalks Sue Ellen at her therapy appointment and tries to reconcile on the strength of his new position as a congressman. She shuts him down hard.
The last time we talked, JR sent you away like a simpering mongrel.
I'm making plans. Big plans for the future.
No. Don't.
Ellie overhears Sue Ellen explaining to Lil John that he'll be fortunate to never know the beauty of the ranch. Ellie goes on a walk around the ranch to reminisce, including on the spot that JR tried to clandestinely drill a year prior. JR accuses Kristen of being money-hungry like her sister, but Kristen says she wants him, not his money. Once he's gone, though, she makes a lunch date with Jordan Lee. That night, Ellie calls the family together and announces that she's saving the ranch by doing the unthinkable, approving oil drilling on Southfork. But she'll never forgive JR for forcing her to violate her father's wishes. And we're out. Obviously, there's a lot to deal with in this episode, and more importantly, there's a lot still to come that will play out over the next episode. Dallas always has 2 things it did very well: marriage drama and corporate drama. This episode leans heavily into the latter to great effect. The writing in the story thread has been on the nose in the best possible way, with characters speaking the stakes directly to the audience.
Well, JR, there are some risks involved. Those wells don't come in, we could lose everything. You're gonna have to put up Southfork as a security. That if any of those offshore leases go bad, and Ewing Oil falls behind in any payments, the banks will take over Southfork.
But those wells not coming in would be absolutely, totally, and in all other ways inconceivable. And then they don't come in. The writing is very basic setup and payoff, but the execution is still compelling every step of the way.
He mortgaged Southfork.
We've talked before about JR's drive to both live up to his father's legacy and earn his love, which is never forthcoming in the way that JR wants it to be. That clearly is the driving force behind his desire to make the deal work. In the Season 2 finale, Miss Ellie blames herself for letting Jock make JR cold and unfeeling, and here it's Jock who blames himself for not teaching JR to see the importance of humanity. And both takes are incredibly myopic on their parts. J.R. Ewing isn't someone who lacks humanity. It's that he can never be satisfied in his father's love.
I will never be satisfied.
At first it's not having a male child as an heir, and then it's allowing Cliff Barnes to get one up on him by closing their Texas oil production. Jock never would have allowed Digger to get over on him like that. The thing is, though, Jock never actually says any of these things directly. He does question why JR and Sue Ellen haven't had a baby in 7 years and Digger's daughter, but the rest is all in JR's head. And that's why he can never get better. He's chasing a fictionalized ideal that he thinks is Jock Ewing. All of this sounds like a rehash if you've been following the series, but the thing that Dallas writers do is bring an evolution to those character foibles based on the situation they put them in. Of course JR is going to risk everything his family ever worked for to get over on Cliff Barnes. Of course Cliff is going to quit the relatively safe position he already has for JR's fool's gold. Of course Bobby is going to be the good son and tattle on his older brother. All these actions are completely predictable now that we've been with the characters for 2 years, but that doesn't make them any less compelling. Truly compelling fiction comes from a combination of twists and anticipation, and for 5 episodes now we've been anticipating the other shoe to drop with JR. The other payoff here is JR's successful attempt to get Cliff to leave the OLM. It was a game of proverbial human chess, and although both men are guided by their stars, their decisions make sense in context. JR rightly believed that Cliff would bankrupt the Ewings by bleeding them dry, so the foreign oil deal was the right thing to do. He just risked more than was acceptable. Cliff was hamstrung by his position, a position that he was in legitimate danger of losing. So running for Congress with that apparent support was the right thing to do. Yes, both men are cursed with greed and ambition, but they're also both making logical decisions against each other. Lastly, the big loser in all of this is Miss Ellie, a woman coming off a mastectomy only to find that her own son has put her in the position of betraying her father's wishes. Bobby and Jock are vociferous in their opposition to her drilling plan, but they don't have anything better. And she rightly points out that the bank isn't going to abide by any promise to a long-dead homesteader. This is Dallas's most Shakespearean of plot twists, with the mother who married to protect her land and position having it placed in jeopardy by the firstborn son that the marriage produced.
And you better say a special prayer for Southfork.
It's pretty King Lear, honestly. Although Shakespeare probably would have had Ellie move in with Gary while the rest of the family had to fend for themselves, just to complete the poetic justice. It's hard to say anything more about this episode without the context of its companion piece, Mother of the Year, so we'll end it here. But always remember that when the noose tightens on old J.R. Ewing's neck, that's when whatever corrupt god he prays to tends to smile on him.